Welcome to the Dr. Dance Mom podcast, your guide to strong dancers with a bright future. I'm your host, Dr. Tara Christensen, doctor of physical therapy, dance medicine specialist, and proud dance mom. Let's dive into today's episode. Hello and welcome everyone back to the podcast. I am so excited for today's topic because it fits so nicely into my own wheelhouse. Today, we're going to talk about strength training for dancers. I'm joined today by Jason Harrison, co-owner of Present Tense Fitness. Jason is a certified strength and conditioning specialist and holds several other certifications as well. Jason's work focuses on individualized strength programming for dancers. He is currently a strength coach for the New York City Ballet and is an associate faculty at School of American Ballet. He also works with dancers from Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater of Harlem, the Dayton Contemporary Dance Company, and Sacramento Ballet. I first met Jason at the IADMS conference in Columbus, Ohio in 2023, an organization to which we are both members, and I'm so excited to welcome him to the podcast. Jason, will you please introduce yourself and tell us a little more about your background and maybe how you started working with dancers?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for asking me to do this. I
Of
always
course.
love being in conversation. As you said, I'm Jason Harrison. My wife and I, Susan, co-own Present Tense Fitness, which started in Dayton, Ohio, and since has expanded to New York City. I've been a personal trainer. I started out here in New York in 2005, just at a commercial gym, and I've been training on and off since then. So basically 20 years now. Didn't start focusing on dance until we opened our studio in Dayton. So around 2015, 2016. And that was honestly just, Dayton has, for a relatively small city, it has a lot of the infrastructure of a much bigger city. So there's two professional dance companies in Dayton, Dayton Ballet and Dayton Contemporary Dance Company. And we brought a few of them in and just started asking them questions about what their days look like, how they approach their training. And though, none of us had any dance background at the time, we just felt like we could help and just, started helping them with like some best practices. And the practice really evolved from there. And everything that we're doing here in New York, New York City Ballet, School of American Ballet, Alvin Ailey, it really is built on the work that originated in Dayton, Ohio, and continues in Dayton, where we still have Dayton Ballet and DCDC people training at the studio. So we're really proud of that.
Yeah, that's very cool. I love the origin story too, because I also did not originally have a super huge dance background. And I think coming into the dance medicine side of things as a professional, it was a little bit intimidating at first, but seeing just like how much success that you've had and just where you are now is really encouraging for anyone who is looking to help the dance population, but maybe feels that little bit of imposter syndrome where they're kind of like, well, I'm not a dancer. How can I help? And, there's a lot that you can learn and certainly can provide a lot of value to the community. So I love hearing that background. So tell me a little bit about, I'm just going to dive right into it here. Like, how important is
Yeah.
strength training for dancers? Because this is, I know, a common topic of conversation these days.
Yeah, I think it's critical. That was sort of the whole, as you said, origin story
Yeah.
of our work. We felt like, what we heard was a lot of like hot yoga and hours on the elliptical. And we thought like, well, obviously there's an interest in cross training, but not so much of experiences rooted in best practices from the strength and conditioning world. One of the things you'll hear from like some old school dance folks is like, well, we never did strength training and we were fine. And it's like, well, were you fine though? Like,
How you feeling?
how many surgeries, how many hip replacements, how many incidents of disordered eating? Like, there's so many things that people barely survived, and we don't know necessarily the stories of everybody who didn't.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think when it comes to treating these artists as full human beings, I think strength training is not just like some extra. It's fundamental to really supporting these artists whose bodies are literally on the line. So I mean, I continue to be amazed that people have done this without strength training, but I think almost to a person, every individual I've ever worked with, pre-professional, professional, has said like, they feel the difference in their body. They feel more stability. They feel more athletic, all of those things. And if you stack that up over time, that can have a big impact, not just during the career, but after the career. Because I think it's our responsibility as professional supporting dancers to think about the person when they're 50 or 60 years old also. And that's what tends to not get thought about so much. But that's our job to think about those things.
Yeah, I can't agree more. And with the population that I work with, so I work with mostly competitive dancers, actually exclusively competitive dancers. And in that space, these are things that aren't often discussed. Or if they're doing strength and conditioning, it's more like dance conditioning. It's not cross training. It's not strength training. It's more like conditioning for dance movement,
Hmm.
which to me is not strength training. That is something completely different. I think the two are very different, especially if they're still moving in, turnout or in extreme movement patterns. That is not necessarily training for just general overall strength as a human being. And so going back to basic, movement patterns, fundamental movement patterns, which I find when I see a lot of these kids, like they don't know how to properly squat or to hinge. And I just
Right.
saw your recent Instagram video on teaching hinging. And I was like, oh my goodness, that's such a good one because it's so hard to teach them how to hinge. And so basic movement patterns are really so fundamental. And so, can you speak to a little bit about how that helps with longevity?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always important to remember that people have to, I mean, obviously, I'm just speaking through the lens of somebody who's an aspiring professional or is going to go on to be a professional. Even if you're dancing professionally, you're still a person who has to move apartments and carry the groceries and walk up flights of stairs. In the United States, at least, New York City is an epicenter of dance, and everybody who lives here, you have to walk, you have to go up and down subway stairs, you have to carry things sometimes uncomfortably long distances, and it's helpful to have like an overall strong body in order to do those things because you hear all the time the stories of athletes whose careers were cut short because of injuries that happened well away from the court or the field. Larry Bird's a great example. He hurt his back and never really recovered. I think shoveling gravel or something.
Mhm.
And so that's the first thing I would say. And then the second thing, like more specific to the practice of dance, if we think about the idea of long-term athletic development, what we know to be true is that the younger the person, the more generalized their cross training should be,
Mhm.
because what you want them to have access to is, like you said, those basic skills: squat, hinge, push, pull. And then you layer the specialized dance training on top of that strong base. And then that can be the individual who is capable of doing lots of different things. And as choreography changes and you have different people coming in to set pieces on companies, you want that individual to be the person who's just like, okay, I got this too. This isn't like how I normally move, but like I have a base. And so moving in this different way for me or partnering in a different way,
Yeah.
um, my body is able to do those things. And so that can really help with longevity. We all know dancers who can pinpoint, um, like a specific piece or something like that, that sort of like set them on a path to injury. And so the younger the dancer, the more we give them this general base, the more durable they're going to be, and the more honestly desirable they're going to be in terms of the ability to do lots of different things. Um, like one of the old school things that you'll still hear people say is like, oh, the men need to be strong because they're partnering. And it's like, well, number one, that's that's never really been true in terms of like the physicality of movement. Physiologically, being partnered requires strength also,
Yes.
just as much as like the person doing the lift. But then also when you consider modern choreography and honestly, hopefully some of the I think gender roles and the performance of gender roles that you see in some dance corners are slowly starting to fall away, where you have women partnering women and displaying their strength. And so taking all of that into consideration, it's even more important for the modern I mean, modern in a timeline context,
Right.
the modern dancer to be able to be strong, have a strong base, be athletic, and be able to do lots of different things because that's what audiences are beginning to expect, and that's what choreographers are setting in these pieces.
Yeah, and in terms of, I know your experience is primarily like in the professional world, but in the competitive world, these kids are being pushed to extremes that, I mean, are honestly like sometimes pretty crazy when you look at the choreography and just the types and the amount of tricks that are involved, which I know there's a whole different conversation to be had about that as well. But just the physical support to be able to perform those things safely is really what I see when I have a lot of kids coming in to rehab injuries or something. A lot of the concern is like, can I do XYZ trick um,
Hmm.
when they have back pain? And I'm like, well, with what that requires, probably not right now. Like maybe you should consider adjusting the choreography for a short period of time to allow for healing. And so a lot of times we see, maybe they're not willing to do that or they don't want to do that. But just having that strong base to begin with helps to mitigate some of those injuries and those overuse type syndromes as well. At what point should dancers start strength training? So, we kind of talked about this briefly before we came on, but working with competitive dancers, a lot of them are starting their dance training at, maybe 2 or 3. So, at a very early age with maybe one class, and then they decide they really like it. And each year they might layer on additional classes and eventually, join a competitive team or a dance company within their studio. And so, is there, in your opinion, a certain number of hours of training where you would suggest they start doing strength training, or is it more or less the level at which they're dancing? Where are you thinking in terms of like when it would be appropriate to start, or how would somebody know when would be the right time?
I mean, I think the way I think about this is the younger the individual, the more they should be moving in lots of different ways.
Yeah.
So part of the answer to that question is if all this individual is doing is dancing,
Yeah.
then having them do strength training basically as soon as they start dancing would be helpful. Now, for, somebody who's 5 or 6, what that's going to look like is not like a barbell on their back. Like we have to have like an expansive view of what strength training is.
Yeah.
And the way, like the younger the individual, the more I think of just like moving in different ways is strength training, climbing, jumping, hopping, skipping, sprinting, tag,
Yeah. Being a
game,
kid.
like being a kid,
Yeah.
like that stuff is really important. And, what we see is sort of like the slow erosion of that kind of movement. I sound like 1,000 years old, but like kids growing up today, their play is much more structured. It's like play dates and like then in this after school activity, it's not so much just like going out and running around and falling out of trees and that
Yeah.
kind of stuff. Um, but that's all of that is strength training. And so if somebody doesn't have access to those things, then working with a coach who has experience working with young people can be really beneficial. Older, as they mature, it starts to look more and more like what we think of traditionally when we think of strength training. Yeah, I mean, being able to move in lots of different ways, because we know like the younger the person, if they do just like the same repetitive patterns, it's literally going to change the structure of their, but like their development.
Yes.
And that's going to cause problems down the line if they don't have, because our body just responds to forces.
Hmm.
And so if we don't give the young person access to different forces, then their body's going to develop in a different way. And that as adults can cause issues down the line. So I think starting people with, you know, we can call it strength training or just movement variety
Hmm.
as soon as possible is helpful. I mean, some of the most resilient dancers I've worked with are people who just like, oh yeah, I I was in gymnastics, or I ran track, or I did. There's a DC dancer that we've worked with who does some of the most amazing work in the company, and she has a track background. And so when you watch her cross training, like all of that's very evident. She's a beautiful dancer, but she has this underlying athleticism that she built early on through moving differently. And that is just like critical for long-term athletic development.
Yeah, and I think just the cross training perspective, I mean, even allowing those young dancers, even if they're competing at 5 or 6 years old, like still letting them explore and participate in other sports if they have the desire to. I know not every child has a desire to. My daughter tried a couple other sports. She didn't really care for them. But at least having them try, because incorporating some of that, and I know like where my daughter dances, there are the way that they schedule the class structure is such that, especially through middle school and high school, they start their classes later so that they do have the opportunity to do after school sports if they desire. And some of them do. So some of them are playing high school sports and then they're coming to dance for a couple of hours. But there's a huge difference in their just overall level of strength and athleticism as a result of that. And so I think
Yep.
it's a really good point. It doesn't have to look like them sitting in a gym, with some dumbbells or a
Right.
barbell, but
Right.
just like variety in their activities as a young person for those competitive dancers is so important. What are some of the benefits dancers see when they start a strength training program? So in terms of the people that you've worked with, what are some of the things that they express to you usually pretty early on, like once they start to see it? Of course, building strength is not something that happens in one session, so I think it's important for people to understand that as well. There's definitely a cumulative effect. So in terms of maybe like frequency of training, so maybe you can speak to that a little bit, and then also the time frame in which people start to see results and what that looks like in their dancing. So how does it change their
Yeah.
dancing?
So to take one of the questions
Yeah.
in there first about frequency, I mean, we've had a lot of success, especially with younger dancers, with 1 day a week
Yeah.
of strength training, especially, given the hours and hours. And, you mentioned coming from a competitive dance background, they are dancing a lot of hours. And so
Hmm.
I wouldn't even recommend more than 1 day a week for those individuals, but 1 or 2 days a week. As people get older, I think more is probably required. So, like the work I do at New York City Ballet right now, I see those dancers twice a week. But they're not, I mean, often, especially in season, they're in and out in like 35 minutes. And what that allows us to do is give a lot of looks at strength and the movement patterns and the benefits of those things, but spreading out the stress. So
Hmm.
it's not like, an hour and 15 minutes all in one session and they hobble into the studio. We're trying to make sure that they're not so wrecked, especially in season. Um, in terms of like how long it takes, I mean, everything you said, I agree with. It takes a while to develop strength. And that's why starting early is really helpful. It takes a long time to develop strength, but then once you're strong, it's really easy to keep it. And so, the strongest people that we know are just people who've been at it for years and years and years consistently. That's also why good programming is important, because if somebody is going a 10 out of 10 hard in the gym every single time, that's not going to be a sustainable practice. They're going to get hurt, they're going to have to take time off, and then they're not going to be as cumulatively strong as they otherwise could be. So it takes time. I will say, and I was deeply skeptical of this the first couple times I heard it, but I've heard it enough
Mm.
that dancers often report feeling a major difference after one session.
Wow.
And my skepticism was because of like what we know is even for like the the neuromuscular adaptations, which we know can happen in the first few weeks.
Right.
It's usually the first few weeks, like that's what the textbooks all say.
Yeah.
And then after that, you build tissue. Connective tissue takes longer to build strength than muscle. Um, but what my theory for why people are reporting with such regularity that after one session they can feel the difference is that it is a neural
Yeah.
response, and that you're giving, in dance, we're drawn to the things that we tend to be good at. And so like a super bendy kid, it's going to be like, oh wow, have they ever considered dancing? Like they'd be really great. And so you have all these super bendy people going into dance, and what they need and what their body craves a little bit is a little bit of like compression, a little bit of tension, a little bit of, if we think about the continuum of stability and mobility, a little bit more stability.
Stability.
And loading somebody with external weights gives their body exactly that. And it does something. They all sort of like make the same hand gesture. They're just like, I just felt better at the bar, or I just felt better. And I think that's probably, it's almost certainly just completely neurological, just giving them some stability and the external feedback of the load. So I think there's a big benefit that can happen right away. But as you said, the long term, like real strength, that is both like the intersection of the neuromuscular and the muscular and the tissue, that takes time. I think people generally feel stronger within a month.
Yep.
I think within 3 months they can start to see the difference in their dance. And then within 6 months, oftentimes they feel like a different person.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times what happens, and I never talk about this, like I don't use this for like marketing or sales or anything, just because I don't know, I don't think it would be ethical, but a lot of times what happens is the existing aches and pains that people have just like slowly drift away over time as they get stronger. I had somebody recently who that I started working with them, and they had been dealing with knee pain. And so we sort of worked around it, didn't do anything. We tried to make sure we didn't prescribe for this individual anything that exacerbated that knee pain. I checked in with them recently. I was like, we haven't talked about it in a while. Like, how have your knees been? And they almost forgot that they had been in pain. And it was just slowly over time, just as they got stronger, they were asking their body to do things that it wasn't prepared for strength wise. And you
Yeah.
just give them a little bit of strength, and then suddenly their joints aren't taking the brunt of the jumps and stuff like that. So I guess it's two answers. I think a lot of people will feel different right away, but
Mm-hmm.
like the real strength takes months.
Yeah. And how are they seeing that translate into their dancing? So like what are some examples of things that you've had dancers come in and say like, "Oh my goodness, this has gotten so much better." And like it's a result of they're recognizing that it's a result of their strength programming.
I think, some of the common ones that we hear, Porter bra just feels that they just feel more, they feel stronger in their Porter bra. A lot of people just report like feeling on their leg more.
Mm-hmm.
People report like, I couldn't do like, a basic turn, and now they're doing, multiples. So Porter bra being more stable on the leg, turns, and then jumps is the obvious one,
Yeah.
where they just like with less effort, they're able to get off the floor more quickly. And then the other thing that you hear quite a bit of is just like stamina improving. Because
Yeah.
people look at that like I'm a strength coach is like the sort of the shorthand, but I am a strength and conditioning coach.
Yeah.
And so the cardiovascular fitness also improves, and that makes people just feel better as they're moving through things. And what I always say, when I'm working with dancers, is the whole point of what we're doing is not to make you the best weightlifter in the world. The whole point of what we're doing is to facilitate your art. And the easier things feel physically, the more they're able to think about connecting with an audience, or connecting with the choreography, or connecting with the music. Like they're able to immerse themselves in the art just a little bit easier than they would otherwise if they weren't quite as strong, or their conditioning wasn't as good. A lot of times dancers are really anxious about high heart rate choreography because they're worried about like basically just surviving it. And if you're just worried about surviving a piece, it's very hard to connect with it artistically.
Yeah.
And so good quality strength and conditioning can allow more space for that too.
Yeah. And I've seen that recently. I have a couple dancers that I've been working with, and one of which who's had chronic like ankle pain for a couple years
Hmm.
now. And I was like, how did you dance in pain for so long? Like, and got a good program going, and now she's able to dance pain free. And I was kind of like, how distracting must that be when you're trying to learn and do choreography to have to constantly worry about like if I land from this jump, is my ankle going to give way or is it going to hurt? And so you're in the middle of performing and that's constantly in the back of your head. So I think there's so many things that it can address. And to that's a really good point because I do think if you're spending all of your time worrying about the effort it takes to get through the choreography, how can you possibly perform to your full potential? And I think that's
Yeah.
kind of like what we're all trying to address here, right? Is just trying to help them that little extra piece. And I think some of them, at least in my space in the competitive dance world, like they don't know that that's a thing. Like they wouldn't know the difference. Um, because they're just coming from this more recreational background into this competitive background, and I don't think the dancers or the parents know that there's a differentiator there. But that's so simple to address. To be honest with you, I mean, it's really just a matter of making sure that they have a good amount of strength and endurance to be able to do that, and that can really elevate their performance in such a big way. So I love that you made that point.
There's another point I think about a lot too, along these lines when it comes to people listening to their bodies. A lot of times if I'm talking to somebody and they find out that I work with dancers, they'll say like, "Oh, they must be like easy to work with because they know their bodies." And it's more complicated than that.
Yeah.
Like I think dancers do know their bodies, but they've also learned over years to disassociate from their
Yeah.
bodies. And that can have really negative effects when it comes to issues around sort of bodily autonomy, um, consent.
Yeah.
There are things that we like, all of this is sort of like integrated together. And so I want the people I work with to, I mean, one of the first sort of training notes that I really try to hammer home when I'm working with new people is like, I need you to tell me what you're actually feeling in your body. And that's a lot of work for people to learn to dial into like pain and acceptable levels of pain in their cross training. I had a one of the dancers I worked with when we were still in Dayton, she was going through a knee thing and I had her do an exercise, and at the end of the last set I was like, how was that? She was like, oh, that was fine. I was like, okay, so if 10 were really painful and one was like nothing, she was like, that was about a 4 or 5. And I playfully like threw my clipboard. I was like, a 4 out of 10 or a 5 out of 10 is not acceptable
No.
in a cross training context. And like it didn't even occur to her that she could say like, oh, this bothers me, can we try something else, or this bothers me, like, can you tell me, is there a form thing? Her training throughout her life since childhood, probably 3 or 4, was to ignore it and please the person in front of the room.
Hmm.
And when you think about like, I mean, I'm saying this to you as if like I'm saying something new. I know I'm not.
No, it's good.
What do you think about girls and women learning to just like please the person in front of the room? Like that's where a lot of the abuse in these spaces comes from. And so I really try to talk to every dancer I work with, like, this is a partnership and we are equals in this partnership. It's your body, it's not mine. I don't
Hmm.
have to dance on it. You do.
Yep.
And so in order for this partnership to work, like, I need you to be honest. I need you to be honest if there's like exercises that don't feel good in your body. Even the next day, maybe it feels fine in the moment. And then the next day, you were having some SI joint issue. Like, I need to know those things. And it's not, you can't hurt my feelings. Um, and I think in order to change dance culture, this is one of the ways where like the praxis of good quality strength and conditioning meets the praxis of teaching young girls and women to own their autonomy. And I think it's important, especially as a man in front of the room, to sort of like reinforce those things. And
Mhm.
so when it comes to, and this is, there's two topics that I've talked about on social media. Like mostly people don't push back on me at all. Like they're
Mhm.
just like, oh, that's a good post. One is like when I was still living in Dayton and I would criticize Dave Chappelle. Like you can't criticize Dave Chappelle in Dayton. And the other one is around consent because I've written and I've talked about publicly a lot, like whenever I'm working, even if it's a room full of 25 people, each individual, if I need to give a manual
Mhm.
correction, I ask for their consent first.
Mhm.
And I always get pushback either on the post or in my DMs. Well, some people need manual feet. Like I get all the arguments, but you can get consent first.
Yeah.
And so I think all of these ideas are actually tied together, and that's a hill I will die on.
Yeah.
And I think I think it's important for the adults to model to, like I said, especially girls and women. Like I'm just because I'm your teacher doesn't mean I just to get put my hands on you.
Mhm.
And that's why I work hard to accumulate as many cues and tools in my coaching toolbox as possible. Like the post that you talked about, I think, I don't know, maybe
Yeah.
before we started recording on the hip hinge.
Hinging. Yeah.
That's just one of the many. I mean, hinging is so difficult to teach. And so you need a lot of cues.
Mhm.
And especially with something like a hip hinge, just given the anatomy, I'm not putting my hands
Mhm.
on a 13-year-old
Yeah.
to teach them how to hinge. I'm gonna use external focuses. I'm gonna use cues. I'm gonna use everything in my toolbox. So it's just responsible coaching in my view.
Yeah. No, that's great. And so you alluded to this a little bit in some of that, but I think like tradition drives a lot of the beliefs around strength training. And so in the dance world, and I think it spills over into the competition world too. And we were talking about studio culture on some episodes, and I think this is sometimes where it comes from too is you've got former professional dancers maybe that are teaching in these studios, and so they're taking their background from their training and then they're kind of bringing it into that environment. And so I think some of it does spill over, and those like traditional beliefs around aesthetics and you know is strength training going to change the aesthetic of my body? And so have you run into any of that, especially working with like some bigger ballet companies and ballet schools? Like, is that something that's talked about?
I think I'll say like there's usually a difference between individuals and institutions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I almost never get pushback from individual dancers. They may ask like, is this gonna make me bulky or is this gonna and but part of my job is to earn buy-in and trust.
Yeah.
And by that time, they usually trust me. And so I give them the science. And like we talked earlier, like if you're doing 1 day a week of strength training or 2 days a week of strength training, it's not enough to elicit like a ton of hypertrophy. And so we have conversations around that. I think with some of the maybe teachers or people in charge of things, those are also conversations that we can have. But as long as you display to them that there are scientific reasons that we can ameliorate some of those concerns, then that usually calms down also because they're also simultaneously getting feedback from the artist saying like how much better they feel.
Yeah.
And so that tends to take care of that. I think one of the things, well, there's two more points on that. One, I think, when I've talked about this, because it's a probably the most common question is like, what about bulk? And I've started sort of answering this in two ways. One is I always start with sort of rooting the fear of bulk contextually, because I think it's important for us to know why there is this fear of bulk. And essentially, my understanding is that this fear is rooted in specifically anti-Black misogyny. So people are, if you look at like, if you, and the great example is like how the Williams sisters were treated in the
Mhm.
tennis world.
Yeah.
All of the attacks on their femininity, on their womanhood, well, they're not real women. Look at, look how big they are. Like that is the fear that people are expressing when they talk about bulk is I don't want to be a big black woman. And we see this throughout our culture in ways obvious and in ways more insidious. And so I always want to contextualize that because that's really what we're talking about when we talk about bulk. And then I will deal with the science around hypertrophy. One of the things people make fun of bodybuilders a lot,
Mhm.
but one of the things bodybuilders know is how to grow a muscle. And whether we call it time under tension, which is like sort of controversial in strength and conditioning circles, or mechanical tension, we know that it takes a lot of repetitions in order to grow muscle. Um, and so a dancer, almost by definition, isn't going to have the excess time or the excess energy to get bulky on accident. There's just
Mhm.
not enough.
Yeah.
There's just like we literally know how many repetitions it takes to grow the size of a deltoid.
Right.
They're just not gonna get that through their cross training. So um, I always want to contextualize the fear, but then also say, listen, like you're not going to accidentally just get huge. You're burning through too many calories. You're dancing too much, and you're not getting enough real mechanical tension or time under tension to elicit the hypertrophy that like of a bodybuilder or something like that.
Right. And then in those cases too, there's like nutritional component that needs to be considered. And I don't think that
Yep,
many of them are going to meet that requirement either in order
that's
to
right.
maintain or grow. So,
Yep.
um, all really good points. If a dancer's looking to start a strength and conditioning program, where do you think they should look? So I see a lot of people asking for online self-guided programs, YouTube videos, Instagram videos, and all of those other things too for exercises. Oh, my dancer's struggling with this. Who can point me to it? And a video that would help them with XYZ. Or does anybody have a video for this exercise? From
Yeah.
my point of view, I'm not a fan because of a number of reasons. But the first is you don't know the source of the information or if it's even good information. The second is, especially with younger people, so I work with a young population. I think it's imperative that they receive some sort of feedback on their form. And that doesn't happen with those self guided videos, even if it's good information. Um, there's no one there to correct them if they're doing it wrong. And you're potentially establishing really poor movement patterns or, potentially creating an injury. So what would your advice be? What are the types of resources or credentials that people can kind of look for to find a good strength coach?
I think it is the most difficult thing that there could possibly be for a parent or a dancer trying to decipher the fitness landscape right now in social media. It's basically impossible
Yeah.
unless you're already in it and know like what's credible and what's not. If you're an outsider coming in, it's virtually impossible to distinguish like who's actually an expert and who's not. Um, I think the one thing I would say is, and this is, I should say like this is admittedly self-serving advice, but I do believe it. I think the question I see like sometimes on social media, people asking those questions, like you said,
Mm-hmm.
but a lot of times it's like, is there a dance person
Right.
that puts out good content I have a young dancer I'm working with and they're traveling is like who's a good dance medicine specialist in Colorado or
Mm-hmm.
whatever. And I think the better question to ask is who's the best physical therapist in this town?
Mm-hmm.
Who's the best strength and conditioning coach in this town? Because, and irrespective of whether those people work with dancers or not, chances are they probably have, number one. But number two, the job of a strength and conditioning specialist or the job of a high quality physical therapist is to evaluate the needs of the person in front of them and help them address those needs. And so, we like in Dayton, we would. we implored people to go. We live just a couple hours from one of the best physical therapists in the world. This guy, Bill Hartman, who's like a legend in my field, like in the strength and conditioning space. And we started like encouraging dancers to go see him. And there was one individual who was talking about retirement, had been dealing with hip pain for 8 years. She walked out of Hartman's office feeling better because he's good at what he does.
Yeah.
And so for me, like in terms of finding a good strength coach, I would look for people with sports performance in their name, or like a facility that's a sports performance facility, because that's a way of sort of like filtering out. It doesn't mean they're going to be good, but as a starting point, it means, okay, they have athletes, and their job, if the athletes aren't getting stronger, faster, better, then they're not going to stay at that facility. And so that's what I would look for. I would shy away from this is where I would shy away from like bodybuilder types, or just like, just like a regular personal trainer who doesn't work with people who have athletic demands, because training somebody for a certain look is much different than training somebody for athletic performance.
Yeah.
And dance happens to have the intersection of both. But again, like a good quality strength and conditioning coach should understand that intersection better than sort of like, like a personal trainer, even at a very fancy, expensive commercial gym. It's just not the same consideration. So that's right. That's the advice I always give, is like look for somebody with like sports performance in their bio
Yeah.
or on their website. Um, and you know, the designations, like I have a CSCS, but like I don't know that that matters so much. But I think it's like who they work with, what their experience is. And honestly, like social media is like can be a good way to sort of decipher, like, even if you're not an expert, you can look at like their approach to the work,
Yeah.
and there's red flags, right? So like if the trainer has their shirt off all the time in their video, you know what I mean? Like that's
Yeah.
real. Then they're more of an influencer than they are a coach.
Yeah.
And they're resting on that. Like, I have ripped abs.
Hmm.
Come to me. That tells me like, okay, you're not actually super confident in your
Skill
your
set.
you know your skill set, your programming, your cueing. Your shirt's just off. So just using sort of like one's spidey sense to decipher. But it's really, really hard, and people in my field make it hard because they're just sort of like capitalizing on people's fears. Like one of the things you're seeing now, at least in my feeds, is, as we've gotten more sophisticated in the field around the conditioning part, so like cardiovascular conditioning. When I started training, we really just talked about like resting heart rate as a marker
Yeah.
of cardiovascular conditioning. And now you're seeing a lot more talk around HRV, heart rate variability.
Hmm.
And now what you're seeing is like people, buy my HRV program
Oh, yeah.
and it's just like, well, what is a HRV? You mean just fitness? Like
Yeah.
all the branding and stuff like that just makes it really difficult to
Yeah.
decipher. So
It's
it's
like
it's a really
catchwords and phrases, and it's the same thing in like supplements. Supplements do the
yes,
same thing.
yep,
Yeah. So in the PT world, it happens as well. I think it's just, and to your point, I think it's a good one. It's like any profession, any field that you're in, there's going to be people that are really good at their job, and there's going to be people that aren't so great at their job. And
hmm
it, especially in the medical side of things, it is really, really hard to know who's good and who's not. And I think a lot of people turn to word of mouth referrals and like Facebook groups and things like that, looking for options. So yeah, I don't really know what the answer is, but I think for myself as a dance medicine physical therapist, like I have been trying to form connections as much as I can with people in the area. I live in a little bit more of a rural area, but I'm not that far from New
mm,
York. I'm only like an hour by car. So,
yeah.
but just trying to find resources that I can refer people out to as well, in different fields and different areas, and just having a good idea of like who those people are. So, you know, there's a list of resources, and I think even dance studios can do that.
Yeah,
Just
100%.
putting together lists of resources that they know locally so they can refer their dancers out to an appropriate person if they're struggling with something or if they are looking for more strength training. Just knowing who's available and who's,
Yeah.
maybe a better fit. So,
Yep.
right.
Yep.
All right. Do you have any other like words of wisdom or any other points that you want to share with the audience as we
I
wrap
think
up?
I think the biggest thing I always want people to know about strength and conditioning and dance is that it is a long-term project. So when people, I agree with the way you categorize like some of those like, very specific, like this is for your, buy my 8-week program for your extension height or whatever. Like it's a long-term project. And so especially, if you think about long-term athletic development, starting in the, you think about starting at a ballet studio or at a competition studio, giving young people a base and then building on that base and earning the right really to be more specific as they get older. But you can't skip those steps. So somebody who, like a 9-year-old working on their extension height, like I get it, but also like let's give her like a strong base. Let's teach her how to squat. Let's teach her how to hinge. Let's teach her how to press something overhead. Let's teach her how to pull something. And then as she gets older, if that leg height still lags, then we can include those things, that specificity, but encouraging people to not take so much of a like almost like a last minute approach where it has to happen now. Like my 11-year-old has to do this now. And it's just like, let's think about your 11-year-old as a 23-year-old, and what's going to be best for that 23-year-old right now is working on some basics.
Yeah.
So,
And
and that,
not
and
extreme
I,
mobility
yeah,
before
exactly,
strength.
exactly, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So I guess that would be the one thing is just like really take a long-term lens. And that's true of like the dancers I work with. That's true of the general population people I work with. Just think of strength and conditioning as things that you will be doing the rest of your life. And that can take some of the anxiety around of like achieving something quickly. And it's just when it's more about like accumulating rep over rep over rep, week after week, month after month, year after year.
Yeah, it's that consistency. Yeah.
Right.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jason. I appreciate having you on today and all of your words of wisdom. I hope that everybody learned something from this episode that they can take with them and really kind of even just think about some of the things that we said today and hope that this gets implemented a little bit more consistently.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode and learned something. Please be sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss a thing. Also, make sure you head over to Instagram and YouTube and follow us there. Send us your listener questions, topic suggestions, and feedback at drdancemompodcast@gmail.com. That's Dr. fully written out, Dance Mom Podcast, also fully written out, at gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening.